Chapter 1. The Quiet Before the Storm. She sat there, a black woman in first class, and the flight attendant's eyes narrowed as if her very presence was a crime. No one else was questioned. Not the white man in the wrinkled suit spilling crumbs on his tray. Nor the woman with the oversized purse taking up 2 seats. But Maya Jackson, with her modest gray sweater and unassuming demeanor, was the one who didn't belong, or so Claire Simmons decided before the plane even left the ground. The first-class cabin of Horizon Wings Flight 512 from Atlanta to Los Angeles buzzed with the low hum of privilege on that chilly December afternoon in 2025. Passengers settled into their plush leather seats, some tapping away at their phones, others sipping pre-flight sparkling water from crystal glasses. The soft clink of ice against glass mingled with the rustle of a magazine being flipped open. And outside, the faint roar of jet engines signaled the final preparations for takeoff. It was a scene of quiet luxury, the kind most people only dreamed of, and one Maya Jackson knew better than anyone aboard. Maya sat by the window in seat 2B, her posture relaxed yet poised, a paperback novel resting in her lap. At 40, she carried herself with an effortless grace that didn't demand attention but commanded respect, if you bothered to look. Her gray sweater hugged her frame, paired with dark jeans and a simple silver watch, the only hint of adornment on her wrist. No flashy jewelry, no designer handbag, no air of entitlement. To the untrained eye, she was just another passenger. But Maya wasn't just anyone. She was the owner of Horizon Wings, a fact she kept closely guarded, preferring to blend in and observe her airline from the inside. She'd flown hundreds of times like this, quietly assessing the service, the staff, the experience, always unnoticed, always underestimated. That was how she liked it. Across the aisle, James Carter, a middle-aged businessman with a salt and pepper beard, adjusted his tie and scrolled through emails on his tablet. His suit was crisp but slightly wrinkled from a long day, and he barely glanced up as a flight attendant offered him a drink. A few seats back, Talia Brooks, a young black woman in her late 20s, sipped her water and watched the cabin with sharp, observant eyes. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair pulled into a neat bun, exuding the confidence of someone who'd fought her way into spaces like this. And then there was Claire Simmons, the lead flight attendant, moving through the aisle with the precision of a drill sergeant. Claire was 45, with 20 years of experience etched into the lines of her face and the stiffness of her posture. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly, her uniform pristine, every button gleaming under the cabin lights. She'd built a reputation as a stickler for rules, the kind of woman who could spot a misplaced carry-on from across the plane. But beneath her polished exterior simmered something less admirable, a quiet bias she'd never admit to. Even to herself. To Claire, first class was a sacred space, reserved for a certain type of person. And as her eyes swept over the cabin, they lingered on Maya just a beat too long. The other passengers barely noticed. James muttered something about a delayed meeting, oblivious to the subtle shift in the air. Talia, though, caught it, the way Claire's lips tightened, the faint tilt of her head as she studied Maya. It wasn't the first time Talia had seen that look, the one that said, "What are you doing here?" She shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around her glass, but she stayed silent for now. Claire approached Maya's seat, her steps deliberate, her clipboard clutched like a shield. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice clipped and formal, loud enough to draw a few curious glances. "I need to see your boarding pass." The request hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. No one else had been asked. Not James, whose tray table was already a mess of snack wrappers. Not the woman 2 rows back who'd barked at a flight attendant for more ice. Just Maya. Maya blinked, caught off guard for a moment. But her composure held. She glanced around. No one else was under scrutiny, then met Claire's gaze with a calm, steady look. "Of course," she said evenly, reaching into her small leather bag. She pulled out the boarding pass, a crisp slip of paper confirming her place in 2B, and handed it over without a word of protest. Claire took it, her fingers brushing the edge as if testing its authenticity, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned the details. Everything checked out. First class, seat 2B, Maya Jackson. But Claire didn't move. She stood there, the pass in her hand, her jaw tight, as if some unspoken rule had still been broken. Maya tilted her head, waiting, her expression unreadable. Around them, the cabin hummed on, oblivious to the storm brewing in that single, fleeting moment. But for Maya, for Talia, for anyone who'd ever felt that same weight of suspicion, it was a storm they knew all too well. Chapter 2. The Seeds of Doubt. Claire Simmons stood frozen for a moment. Maya Jackson's boarding pass still clutched in her hand, the ink glaring back at her like an accusation she couldn't dismiss. The cabin lights glinted off her polished name tag as she hesitated, her lips parting slightly, then closing again. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her tone measured but laced with a skepticism that cut deeper than her words. Maya inhaled slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. She'd heard that question before, not on this flight, but in boardrooms, at hotel check-ins, in stores where cashiers double-checked her credit card. "That's what the ticket says," she replied, her voice steady, almost too calm. She didn't raise it, didn't snap, didn't give Claire the reaction she might have expected. Around them, the first-class cabin carried on its quiet rhythm. James Carter tapped away at his tablet. A flight attendant poured sparkling water for a woman in 4A, but the air between Maya and Claire crackled with unspoken tension. Claire's eyes flicked over Maya again, taking in the gray sweater, the jeans, the lack of anything ostentatious. No Louis Vuitton bag, no diamond studs, nothing to signal wealth the way she'd been trained to recognize it. She handed the boarding pass back, her fingers lingering just a second too long, as if reluctant to let go of her doubt. "Enjoy your flight," she said, the words clipped and forced, before turning sharply on her heel and striding back down the aisle. Her heels clicked against the carpet, a staccato beat that echoed her unease. James Carter lowered his tablet, his brow furrowing as he watched Claire retreat. "What was that about?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Talia Brooks to hear. Talia didn't look up from her water glass, but her lips twitched into a faint, bitter smile. "Same old story," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience. She'd been in Maya's shoes, questioned, scrutinized, made to prove her right to exist in spaces others took for granted. She adjusted her blazer and glanced at Maya, who was now gazing out the window, her expression unreadable. The plane jolted slightly as it taxied toward the runway, and Claire busied herself with pre-flight checks, her movements brisk and mechanical. But her mind was elsewhere. She'd seen passengers like Maya before, black men and women in first class who didn't look the part. At least not to her. She prided herself on maintaining order, on keeping this exclusive space exclusive. It wasn't personal, she told herself. It was procedure. Yet as she passed James Carter, offering him a warm smile and a, "Can I get you anything, sir?" she didn't stop to check his boarding pass. His presence didn't need verifying. He belonged. Maya felt the weight of Claire's stare even after she'd walked away. She'd built Horizon Wings from the ground up, turning a failing regional carrier into a national name. But moments like this reminded her how little that mattered to some people. They didn't see her title, her success, her power. They saw her skin. She opened her book again, flipping to a dog-eared page. But her mind wasn't on the words. It was on Claire, on the subtle jab of that question, on the countless times she'd swallowed her anger to keep the peace. A young flight attendant, Ryan Kim, approached with a tray of drinks, his dark hair slightly tousled, his demeanor softer than Claire's. "Sparkling water, ma'am?" he asked Maya, his tone polite but genuine. She nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you." Ryan hesitated, glancing back toward Claire, who was now fussing over a passenger's blanket in row 5. "Don't mind her," he said quietly, almost a whisper. "She's particular." Maya raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew what particular meant in this context. As Ryan moved on, Talia leaned forward slightly, catching Maya's eye. "You handled that better than I would've," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'd have told her where to shove that clipboard." Maya chuckled softly, the sound barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Sometimes silence says more," she replied. Talia nodded, settling back into her seat, but her fingers tapped restlessly against her armrest. She knew silence could be a weapon, but she also knew it often came at a cost. The plane lifted off, climbing into the gray Atlanta sky, and the cabin settled into a fragile calm. Claire disappeared into the galley, her clipboard tucked under her arm. But the seed of doubt she'd planted lingered. Maya sipped her water, the cold glass grounding her as she watched the clouds roll past. She thought that was the end of it, a minor annoyance. A fleeting sting. She was wrong. Claire wasn't done, and the next hour would prove just how far her particular nature could take her. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point. An hour into the flight, Horizon Wings 512 had reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dimmed, and the cabin settled into a drowsy hum. Passengers reclined their seats, some watching movies on personal screens, others dozing under thin blankets. Maya had slipped an earbud into one ear, the faint strains of jazz filtering through as she flipped through her book. The tension from Claire's earlier interrogation had faded, or so she thought, until the sharp click of heels announced the flight attendant's return. Claire stopped at 2B, her posture rigid, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin's quiet like a knife. "I need you to come with me." Her tone wasn't a request, it was a command, edged with a certainty that made Maya's stomach tighten. She removed her earbud, turning to face Claire fully. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but alert, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We need to have a conversation," Claire replied, her jaw set. "In private, now." The word now landed like a gavel, and a ripple of unease spread through the cabin. James Carter set his drink down, his brow lifting as he turned to watch. Talia Brooks straightened in her seat, her phone already in hand, thumb hovering over the record button. Even the woman in 4A, who'd been fussing with her blanket, paused to glance over. Maya didn't move. "If there's something you need to say, you can say it here," she said, her tone steady, her gaze locked on Claire's. The air grew thick, the hum of the engines suddenly louder in the silence that followed. Claire's nostrils flared, her fingers twitching at her sides. "This isn't a discussion," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to turn heads. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to involve security when we land." A murmur ran through the cabin. James leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "She's got a ticket. What's the problem?" Talia didn't bother keeping her voice down. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, shaking her head as she pressed record. The camera caught Claire's stiff posture, Maya's unyielding calm, the growing tension in the air. Ryan Kim appeared from the galley, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, glancing between the two women. Claire answered before Maya could. "She's refusing to cooperate," she said, her voice tight. Ryan blinked, caught off guard. "With what?" he pressed. Claire hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. Maya seized the moment, her tone still even but sharp enough to cut. "She hasn't actually told me why she wants me to move. I think we'd all like to hear it." Passengers leaned in, listening now, their pretense of disinterest gone. Claire squared her shoulders, her voice dropping but firm. "I don't believe she's supposed to be in this seat." The words landed like a slap, raw and unfiltered. A sharp scoff came from Talia. "You've got to be kidding me," she repeated, louder this time. James set his glass down with a clink, a slow smirk tugging at his lips. "She checked her ticket already," he said, his tone dry. "What's next? A DNA test?" Ryan's face paled, his eyes darting to Claire. "You already verified it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The cabin buzzed with whispers, passengers exchanging glances. Claire didn't back down. "I need to verify it again," she insisted, her throat bobbing as she swallowed. Maya's lips parted, not in shock but in a quiet, dawning understanding. She reached into her bag, pulling out the boarding pass once more, and held it up for all to see. "Here," she said, her voice clear. "Verify it again." Ryan stepped forward before Claire could, snatching the ticket from Maya's hand. He skimmed it, then exhaled sharply. "She's in the right seat," he said, loud enough for the cabin to hear. The murmurs grew louder, a mix of disbelief and indignation. Claire's fingers twitched, her face flushing as the weight of her mistake pressed down. And then she made it worse. She reached out, grabbing Maya's arm to pull her up. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Talia's camera caught it all, the sudden movement, the shock on Ryan's face, the way James stood up, his drink forgotten. "Hey," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. Claire pulled her hand back. Too late, her eyes wide with the realization of what she'd done. Maya tilted her head, not in anger, not in fear, but in something far more dangerous, absolute control. She picked up her phone, pressed a single button, and lifted it to her ear. The cabin held its breath as she spoke. Her voice measured, undeniable, ground control. "This is Maya Jackson, owner of Horizon Wings. There's been an incident on Flight 512. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The cabin of Horizon Wings Flight 512 fell into a stunned silence. The hum of the engines swallowed by the weight of Maya Jackson's words. Ground control. This is Maya Jackson, owner of Horizon Wings. There's been an incident on Flight 512. Her voice, calm and controlled, sliced through the air like a blade, each syllable landing with precision. Claire Simmons froze, her hand still hovering where it had grabbed Maya's arm, her face draining of color as the reality sank in. Eyes widened, breaths hitched, and for a moment, no one moved. James Carter was the first to break the spell. A slow, deliberate clap echoing from his seat. "Well, damn," he said, his smirk widening as he leaned back, crossing his arms. Talia Brooks kept her phone steady, the red recording light glowing as she captured every second of Claire's unraveling. Ryan Kim stepped back, his tray of drinks forgotten, his mouth slightly agape. Passengers who'd been half asleep or buried in their screens now sat upright, their attention riveted on the scene unfolding in 2B. Maya lowered the phone, her gaze locking onto Claire's. "Yes, I'll hold," she said into the receiver, her tone as steady as ever. Before pressing it to her shoulder, she tilted her head slightly, studying Claire with an expression that wasn't anger, wasn't smugness, but something far more piercing, clarity. "You didn't expect that, did you?" she asked, her voice low but audible to those nearby. Claire's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands dropped to her sides, trembling faintly, her clipboard slipping to the floor with a soft thud. I didn't mean," she stammered, her voice cracking for the first time. Maya cut her off, raising a hand. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't apologize because I'm the owner. Apologize because you were wrong from the start." The words hung heavy, a judgment delivered without malice but with unyielding truth. Talia zoomed in with her phone, muttering under her breath, "Say it louder for the people in the back." James chuckled, shaking his head as he sipped his drink. Now thoroughly invested, Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Maya and Claire, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Maya lifted the phone again as a voice crackled through. "Ms. Jackson, this is ground operations. What's the situation?" She didn't hesitate. "I've been harassed by a flight attendant on this flight. Her name's Claire Simmons. She questioned my right to be in first class, refused to explain why, and just physically grabbed me when I wouldn't comply with her baseless demands." Her recounting was factual, devoid of emotion, but it painted a picture so clear that even Claire couldn't deny it. The cabin buzzed with whispers, passengers leaning toward one another, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "She grabbed her?" a woman in 4A murmured, her blanket slipping to the floor. "That's insane." Another voice chimed in from the back. Talia's video was already picking up the chatter, the collective outrage building like a wave. Claire's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the cabin, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "I was just doing my job," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya's gaze didn't waver. "Your job is to serve passengers, not to judge them," she replied. "You didn't question him," she nodded toward James, when he spilled his drink. "You didn't ask her," a glance at the woman in 4A, "to prove her seat when she demanded extra pillows." "But me? You needed proof I belonged." The truth stung, and Claire flinched as if struck. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it, her shoulders slumping. Ryan stepped forward, his voice tentative. "Claire, maybe we should." She waved him off, her face hardening again, but the defiance was hollow. She'd lost, and she knew it. The voice on the phone returned. "Ms. Jackson, we've located Ms. Simmons' file. She's suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Security will meet her when you land. Maya nodded, a faint exhale escaping her lips. Thank you, she said, ending the call. She set the phone down, her movements deliberate, and looked at Claire one last time. You're done here, she said simply. Claire's knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself, turning abruptly and stumbling toward the galley. Passengers watched her go, some with pity, others with satisfaction. Talia stopped recording, a triumphant gleam in her eye as she whispered, "That's going viral." James raised his glass in a mock toast. "To justice," he said, draining it. Ryan lingered, his expression conflicted, but he nodded at Maya with a quiet respect before retreating. Maya leaned back in her seat, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a weary calm. She hadn't wanted this, not the confrontation, not the spectacle, but Claire had left her no choice. Outside, the clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder of the world beyond this cabin. A world where moments like this happened far too often. She closed her eyes, letting the jazz in her earbud wash over her, knowing the real work was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Aftermath. The plane touched down in Los Angeles under a slate-gray sky, the wheels screeching against the tarmac as Horizon Wings Flight 512 came to a stop. Claire Simmons was escorted off first, flanked by 2 security officers. Her head bowed, her uniform suddenly looking too big for her shrinking frame. Maya Jackson stepped out last, her gray sweater unchanged, her presence as unassuming as ever. She wasn't angry, wasn't triumphant, she was simply there, waiting as the consequences unfolded. At the gate, Claire glanced back, their eyes meeting briefly. Maya stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Don't let this define you," she said. "Learn from it." Claire nodded, a flicker of shame crossing her face before she was led away. Maya turned to Ryan Kim, who'd lingered nearby. "Treat people right," she told him. "That's all that matters." He smiled faintly, nodding, and walked off to debrief. Talia's video hit social media within hours, racking up millions of views, sparking debates about race, power, and accountability. Maya returned to her office, determined to root out the biases Claire had embodied. Claire, jobless, faced a mirror she couldn't avoid, and somewhere, a lesson lingered, for her, for Horizon Wings, for anyone watching. Respect isn't optional, and ignorance comes with a price.